Hello, fellow kids, and welcome back to What is Politics? In this episode, we'll be covering the rest of Chapter 3 from David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything. And this chapter is entitled Unfreezing the Ice Age. In this part of the book, the authors try to argue that human societies used to shift back and forth from hierarchy to equality for fun, play, and expedience, which leads them to their big thesis question of the book. If societies in the past used to shift back and forth from hierarchy to equality, seemingly at will, then how is it that for the past several thousand years, most societies seem to be stuck in hierarchy? Before we get into the texts, let's do a little recap of some of the important theory points that we've been making in this series, so that we can understand what we're reading, and also so that we can understand what's going on in the world around us. Last time, we looked at the difference between dominance hierarchy, where the hierarchy benefits the people on the top of the hierarchy and is imposed by them, versus a democratic hierarchy, where the hierarchy is formed for the benefit of its members by its members, and where the people on the top of that hierarchy only get to be there insofar as they benefit the rest. In the future, we'll look at how democratic versus dominance hierarchy is a spectrum, and how democratic hierarchy can morph into dominance hierarchy in the right circumstances, or rather, the wrong circumstances. But what we need to understand today is that while people might choose to establish a democratic hierarchy in order to achieve shared goals for the sake of efficiency, the idea that a society as a whole would choose to establish itself as a dominance hierarchy does not make any sense. Dominance hierarchies are chosen by the people on the top of those hierarchies, and they're imposed on the people on the bottom, who at best tolerate it for lack of better options. Now, because people don't choose to be stuck in dominance hierarchy on purpose, the existence of a dominance hierarchy can only be explained by particular circumstances, which give some people certain bargaining power advantages over others. And we saw that there's basically only one general recipe for all dominance hierarchies. First, you need to have some people who are able to control access to resources that other people need. And second, you need for there to be no preferable alternatives to get those resources other than subject yourself to the commands of the people who control those resources. So if we want to answer Graeber and Wengrow's question of how we got stuck in hierarchy, meaning if you want to understand where a particular dominance hierarchy comes from and how to get rid of it, or how to reduce its severity, then first you need to ask, what are the conditions that are giving some people the ability to impose their choices on other people? And then once you've identified those, the next thing you need to ask is, what can we do to change those conditions in a way that reduces or eliminates those advantages? Unfortunately, as Graeber and Wengrow will tell us in Chapter 5, they explicitly don't want to think about conditions or circumstances. Instead, they want to focus on conscious choice and freedom. And the reason for this is because they mistakenly think that if conditions are what result in hierarchy or equality, then this means that we are truly stuck forever in hierarchy today because of the conditions inherent to advanced industrial civilization. And they quote Jared Diamond and others to that effect in Chapter 1. Unfortunately, as a result of trying to focus on discombobulated conscious choices outside the context of the conditions in which these choices are made, not only are the authors unable to answer their own questions, but they routinely bury or ignore all of the parts of the sources that they discuss which actually do answer those questions. Materialism and agency are not opposed to each other. Materialism is simply the context in which freedom and choice are exercised. And without it, we throw away our best tools for understanding why people make the choices that they make. And we throw away our best tools for predicting what choices they will make, which makes it impossible to design institutions and rules that will have the effects that we want them to have. So now let's get into the book and let the cartoon begin. So this part of the chapter starts off with some intellectual history. The authors point out that in the ancient world, philosophers from Greece to India to China took it for granted that we only really think when we dialogue with others, and that this is why so many philosophical works are written as dialogues instead of just monologues. Individual consciousness, on the other hand, was something that was seen as exceptional, and could only be attained through a life of contemplation and study. Quote, "Humans were only fully self-conscious when arguing with one another, trying to sway each other's views, or working out a common problem. True individual self-consciousness, meanwhile, was imagined as something that a few wise sages could perhaps achieve through long study, exercise, discipline, and meditation. What we'd now call political consciousness was always assumed to come first." Unquote. But then, in Europe, with the Enlightenment, intellectuals got all of this backwards, according to the authors, because they saw Europe as waking up out of 1,000 years of superstition and rigid religious dogma. European philosophers assumed that ordinary people could have narrow individual consciousness, but politically, they just blindly followed traditions, and that political consciousness wasn't possible until civilization and literature and enlightenment made it possible, and that these things were only available to the educated and well-read. Quote, "All of this would have come as a great surprise to Kandiaronk, the 17th century Wendat philosopher-statesman, whose impact on European political thought we discussed in the previous chapter. Like many North American peoples of his time, Kandiaronk's Wendat nation saw their society as a confederation created by conscious agreements open to continual renegotiation." Unquote. Okay, so far so good as far as I know, since I have no knowledge of this field. But then the authors come back to their condescending misrepresentations about the anthropology of hunter-gatherers. Quote, "Scholars still write as if those living in earlier stages of economic development, and especially those who are classified as egalitarian, can be treated as if they were literally all the same, living in some collective groupthink. If human differences show up in any form, different, quote, bands being different from each other, it is only in the same way that bands of great apes might differ. Political self-consciousness, or certainly anything we'd now call visionary politics, would have been impossible." Unquote. As usual on this subject, the authors are arguing with scholars from the 1970s, or before that. Scholars no longer write like that, unless they're discussing the entire Paleolithic era in like 2 pages in order to make a larger point about something else, because you can't make generalizations or discuss giant periods of time in any other way. But then, as they do so many times in this book, the authors try to have it both ways. Quote, "Now, admittedly, there have always been exceptions to this rule. Anthropologists who spend years talking to indigenous people in their own languages and watching them argue with one another tend to be well aware that even those who make their living hunting elephants or gathering lotus buds are just as skeptical, imaginative, thoughtful, and capable of critical analysis as those who make their living by operating tractors, managing restaurants, or chairing university departments." Unquote. Okay, newsflash. Anthropologists who spend years talking to indigenous peoples in their own languages is literally every cultural anthropologist with a PhD. That is how you get your PhD. The authors are trying to make it seem like there are these good anthropologists who humanize their subjects, but then there are all these bad anthropologists who believe in egalitarian origins and make generalizations about cultures. But in the real world, these are basically the exact same anthropologists doing both of these things. When you write an ethnography, which is a book about a culture that you've spent like several years living with, you will tend to write a lot of individualized stories about all the people you lived with for the years that you spent there. But then, if you're the exact same person and you go and write a book about anything involving humanity as a whole, like human origins, or the evolution of violence, or the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, you're going to talk mostly in ways that erase individuality, because you can't talk about these topics in any other way. For the authors to chastise people for this is like getting mad at someone who takes pictures of the Earth from outer space for erasing human individual identities. It's just nonsense. The authors then go on to point out that in many traditional societies, eccentric and nonconformist people are not punished for deviating from social norms, but instead they're often revered or celebrated in different ways. And they go on to talk about how in times of crisis, the Nuer pastoralists in southern Sudan will often elevate people who would be considered insane or schizophrenic and follow them as prophets. Quote, "A person who might otherwise have spent his life as something analogous to the village idiot would suddenly be found to have remarkable powers of foresight and persuasion, even to be capable of inspiring new social movements among the youth, or coordinating elders across Nuerland to put aside their differences and mobilize around some common goal, even, sometimes, to propose entirely different visions of what Nuer society might be like." Unquote. Now, this is correct, And it's also super interesting. But what would have been more interesting and more useful would have been for the authors to talk about how these Nuer bipolar prophets aren't just randomly proposing different visions of what Nuer society might look like. They're fulfilling a specific social function in response to particular conditions, as others have historically done in similar conditions. The whole phenomenon of crazy prophets in Nuer society seems to be a recent phenomenon, starting around the turn of the 20th century. And according to E. Evans Pritchard, who wrote the classic studies of the Nuer in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Nuer prophecy began as a response to war and aggression from the outside, which required the Nuer, who are a male egalitarian tribal society with no political leaders and no formal organization beyond the tribal level, to organize massive coordinated responses to colonial invaders and other people encroaching on their territories. So the reason that people suddenly started following anomalous weirdos who don't conform to social norms is because these people allowed the tribe to coordinate under leadership in ways that couldn't otherwise have happened within the confines of their existing social structure. If you elevated a normal person to special leadership status, it would disrupt the whole egalitarian social order and create disruption and conflict. But you could elevate a weirdo person who is already outside the norms of the existing politics without threatening the fiercely egalitarian power balance between males in Nuer society. Evans Pritchard also noticed that the Nuer culture as a whole had many similarities to the ancient Israelites in the early parts of the Old Testament, including the prophetic tradition. The ancient Israelites were nomadic pastoralists, just like the Nuer, with a similar social and political structure at that point in time. And the early biblical prophets emerged in similar circumstances, in order to unite independent competing tribes to fight wars in a system that allowed for no higher political authority beyond the male head of the family. Monotheism is thought to have emerged for related reasons, as a locus to unite different competing tribes with different identities into one political formation versus others. And Evans Pritchard noted that monotheistic ideas were gaining traction among the Nuer and spread by some of their recent prophets as well, apparently for similar reasons. Now, I think this stuff about monotheism is what the authors are hinting about when they talk about Nuer prophets allowing us to imagine a whole new type of social organization. But I think that they left out all of this context for a reason. Because all this stuff just highlights how important conditions are, to the extent that people 5,000 years apart, living in totally different worlds from different racial, religious, and ethnic groups, end up making very similar choices in similar circumstances. So now the authors try to push their conscious choice theory by talking about three cultures that change their social structures seasonally. Or do they? First, they talk about the Nambikwara, who are an Amazonian people who, according to Claude Levi-Strauss, do horticulture in the rainy season for about 5 months, and then they do hunting and gathering in very difficult conditions for the rest of the year. And the first point that the authors try to make here is that the Nambikwara don't fit into the supposedly rigid evolutionary models of behavioral ecologists / materialist anthropologists who divide people up into artificial categories like hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists and pastoralists and sedentary farmers. Supposedly, these anthropologists' heads would just explode at the idea of a culture that goes from one mode of production to another seasonally. And the authors seem to be implying that we should stop using these types of categories altogether. As proof that these categories are useless, as is all of materialist anthropology, the authors tell us that not only do the Nambikwara change economic activities from season to season, but they also change their social structure, telling us that their chief has much more power and authority in the foraging season than he does in the horticulture season, which according to the authors is supposed to be the opposite of what materialist behavioral ecology models tell us. Apparently, in the two-dimensional 1960s caricature that Graeber and Wengrow paint of modern anthropological theory, hunter-gatherers are all supposed to be egalitarian, and farmers are all supposed to be hierarchical, which of course is strawman nonsense. There are plenty of hierarchical foragers and plenty of relatively egalitarian horticulturalists, which anthropologists have been discussing since the 19th century. And remember that Marx and Engels' discussion of primitive communism was based on the Haudenosaunee horticulturalists. On top of that, the authors tell us that the Nambikwara chiefs act like modern welfare statesmen, redistributing wealth to the poor, just like we see in our big industrial civilizations. So boom, there are no categories. Take that, stages of history, even though stages of history theories have already been dead for many, many decades already. All of this is why anthropology has supposedly ignored the Nambikwara and all of the lessons that they can teach us about agency and freedom and political consciousness and blah, 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 blah. Now, there is such a mess going on here that my head is still spinning. I was originally going to read the author's sources and then give materialist explanations for the seasonal differences in Nambikwara's social and political structure, but that turned out to be impossible, and you'll see why shortly. The authors tell us that, according to Claude Levi-Strauss, quote, chiefs made or lost their reputations by acting as heroic leaders during the nomadic adventures of the dry season, during which times they typically gave orders, resolved crises, and behaved in what would at any other time be considered an unacceptably authoritarian manner. In the wet season, a time of much greater ease and abundance, they relied on those reputations to attract followers to settle around them in villages, where they employed only gentle persuasion, and led by example to guide their followers in the construction of houses and tending of gardens. In doing so, they cared for the sick and needy, mediated disputes, and never imposed anything on anyone. Unquote. But Levi-Strauss doesn't say anything like this at all. According to Levi-Strauss, the chief had no coercive authority, ever, and his only power was persuasion, all year round. If anything, you could read into Levi-Strauss that the chief had less authority in the hunting season, because if he didn't do a good job, people would just leave and join a different band, to the point where he could actually lose his position. But Levi-Strauss doesn't say anything specifically about changing levels of authority either way. It seems like the authors just made this stuff up in order to make it seem like the Nambikwara had two different political systems, and that scarecrow strawman anthropologists are wrong about hunter-gatherers always being egalitarian, which of course no one believes. I'll include the relevant parts of the Levi-Strauss text in the transcript because I had originally included a whole section comparing the two Graeber and Wengrow texts to the Levi-Strauss text, but then, just before recording this, I found out that the Nambikwara don't actually even switch from hunting and gathering to farming to begin with. David Price and Paul Aspelin, who independently of each other each lived with the Nambikwara for years at a time in the 1970s, both confirm that the Nambikwara do not actually switch from nomadic foraging in one season to sedentary farming in the other season. And Aspelin found that this was also the case in Levi-Strauss's time as well. Apparently Levi-Strauss only stayed with them during an extended hunting expedition, and he had misunderstood this to be their way of life for 7 months out of the year, and he had never even visited a farming village. So while I can't give materialist explanations for things that don't exist, what I can do is point out that the author's war on categories is completely insane. It's this very typical postmodern brain disease, where you start with an important and valid critique, like that categories are just tools, they're not fixed realities, and they're not perfect, and they can lead us in wrong directions if we take them too seriously. But then, instead of translating that into constructive lessons, they just go straight into throw the baby out with the bathwater mode. Eliminate all categories. Each individual person is different. Each individual tree is different. There are no species. Spruce trees are a social construct. And the result is that if you take this garbage seriously, it prevents you from being able to apply knowledge in any practical way. All categories of things that exist in the real world, even things like fruits versus vegetables, arms versus wrists, berries versus citrus fruits, or man versus woman, as is topical nowadays. These categories are all imperfect and they break down at a certain point. But we use them anyways, because they are shortcuts that prevent us from having to reinvent the wheel every single time we encounter things. Like, good luck figuring out which wood to use if you want to build a house, if you don't know the difference between a pine tree and a Douglas fir. Or imagine trying to be a surgeon if you refuse to acknowledge that the heart and the stomach are separate organs, because there's no exact way to tell where one ends and the other begins, and all organs are actually interconnected and work like one big system, dude. It'd be like being paralyzed on mushrooms staring at the ceiling. This is why academia has turned into a giant masturbation festival since postmodernist paradigms took over. The reason that we create subsistence categories in anthropology, like foragers, pastoralists, horticulturalists, immediate return versus delayed return foragers, is because those subsistence practices tend to create conditions which have important and specific consequences on culture and political structure and ideology and religion and all sorts of other things. For example, as I've mentioned before, immediate return hunter-gatherers are almost always hyper-egalitarian, while hunter-gatherers who focus primarily on fishing are usually very hierarchical. and crucially to the author's thesis questions about how do we get stuck in hierarchy. Having these kinds of categories helps you isolate the causes and patterns and similarities that you will find within those categories. What is it about nomadic pastoralism that always results in male dominance and cultures that have a lot of blood feuds and honor codes? Why are people in horticultural societies often so obsessed with accusing each other of witchcraft? Why is it that immediate return foragers never seem to care very much about witchcraft, and they don't frequently get caught up in blood feuds? We have a lot of very good answers to these types of questions, but you'll never learn anything about any of them from the dawn of everything, because the authors' heads are buried too deep inside of their own bunguses, wanking on about freedom and choice totally out of context of the practical conditions in which those choices are made. One of the main effects of the postmodern turn in academia, where you attack anyone who does any generalizing or who looks for materialist answers to things, or who even uses categories, is that humanities academia is no longer oriented towards producing anything that can help anyone do anything to change society. You can't even take the first step of asking why anything happens. You can ask who, what, where, when, how, but if you ask why, that inevitably leads to materialist inquiries. And suddenly everyone gets uncomfortable, like you just made a big stinky. And then they start accusing you of essentialism and of objectifying people and whatever other nonsense. And this is probably one of the reasons why postmodernism is so popular in elite academia, because it totally neutralized the threat to power that started to emerge in the 1960s and 70s as working class people started entering university for the first time through the GI Bill. And ironically, although David Graeber was very critical of postmodernism, and although he and Wengrow wrote this book because they want to encourage us to change our society, Dawn of Everything very much contributes to these awful trends. In Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, David Graeber wrote, quote, "In many ways, anthropology seems a discipline terrified of its own potential. It is, for example, the only discipline in a position to make generalizations about humanity as a whole, yet it resolutely refuses to do so." Unquote. And that's exactly right. But unfortunately, in this book, they're lobbing attacks that, if taken seriously, would make it impossible to make any generalizations about anything. Now, if we read the work of authors who actually lived with the Nambikwara, we can see that there are differences of power in chiefly authority, but not between different seasons, but rather between different chiefs in different regions of Nambikwara territory. David Price did a study of 70 Nambikwara chiefs, and he found that 61 of those chiefs almost never told anyone what to do at all, ever. They led entirely by example. Quote, "The typical leader begins making a garden, and other men join him. He announces his intention to hunt peccary, and other men go along." Unquote. According to Price, the chief's authority is so non-existent that maybe he shouldn't even be thought of as a chief at all, but more of as a respected elder brother member of his band, which he often literally is. Now, the 9 other chiefs still had no enforcement power, but unlike those 61 chiefs, they actually did issue commands and tell people what to do. And all of these more authoritarian-style chiefs all lived in a northern area where the Nambikwara were frequently under attack, which creates emergency-type conditions, which Price believes was the reason why people in those groups tolerated being given orders. Anyhow, Graeber and Wengrow continue. Quote, "What impressed Levi-Strauss above all was the Nambikwara's political maturity. It was the chief's skill in directing small bands of dry season foragers, of making snap decisions in crises, crossing a river, directing a hunt, that later qualified them to play the role of mediators and diplomats in the village plaza. But in doing so, they were effectively moving back and forth each year between what evolutionary anthropologists, in the tradition of Turgot, insist on thinking of as totally different stages of social development, from hunters and foragers to farmers and back again." Unquote. Ugh. So now the authors are pretending that we're not just stuck in the 1950s, but we're stuck in the 1850s. No one believes that foraging or farming are different stages of development anymore. They're different adaptations to different conditions. There are all sorts of examples of people who quit farming and become foragers, or pastoralists, or back and forth and around. In the 19th century, you had the classic idea that Turgot first proposed, but was much more famously articulated by Lewis Henry Morgan, that you had these stages of development where people moved from the worst, hardest form of economy, hunting and gathering, up to better and better ones, pastoralism, then horticulture, then farming, and then awesome civilization. or as Morgan put it, from savagery to barbarism and civilization, with different substages for each obnoxious category: lower savagery, middle savagery, higher savagery, etc. Although Morgan actually had enormous respect for the Native American people that he lived with and studied, there was a clear implication in his scheme that societies were advancing up the ladder of progress to becoming awesome civilized gentlemen with big sideburns, stiff upper lips, and extreme constipation issues. These types of theories completely fell out of favor, especially after World War II and the rise of anti-colonialism and civil rights struggles. But they revived in a very different form in the late 1960s and 70s after the Man-the-Hunter Conference, because people became interested again in how we went from equality to hierarchy. But modern social evolution theory is not about stages and progress from worse to better or from simple to complex. It's about adaptation to conditions, a lot like biological evolution theory. And people don't talk about this anymore, but it's always been a staple of anthropology that the whole reason that humans have such extensive cultures in the first place is precisely to adapt to our environment and to our circumstances. So cultural evolution could mean going from a simple social structure to a more complex one, like you can't build a car without first having invented wheels and oil extraction and metalsmithing first, but it could also mean becoming more simple, like going from a stratified agricultural society with hierarchy and specialization to a more egalitarian hunting and gathering society, which various societies have done, like the Lakota that we'll talk about in a bit. Any lingering ideas of social complexity equating with progress fell apart when we realized, especially in the late 1970s, that moving from hunting and gathering to agriculture almost always resulted in going down the ladder in terms of quality of life. Mark Nathan Cohen found that most societies that adopted agriculture for the first time did so out of desperation, and he was looking at archaeological evidence from the societies that first transitioned to agriculture. And people's health measures decreased drastically after the transition. And Marvin Harris, one of the big materialist anthropologists of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, found that every major increase in technological and social complexity was actually adopted out of desperation. And then the authors make up some more stuff. Quote, although Levi-Strauss went on to become the world's most renowned anthropologist, and perhaps the most famous intellectual in France, his early essay on Nambikwara leadership fell into almost instant obscurity. To this day, very few outside the field of Amazonian studies have ever heard of it. Unquote. So that's what Graeber and Wengrow say about this article about the Nambikwara. But anthropologist David Price, on the other hand, writing in the 1980s, when social evolutionism was really going strong, tells us that the exact same article has, quote, a central place in the literature of comparative politics. It has become a classic study in primitive leadership, assigned to students and cited in other articles whenever an example of the world's simplest political institutions is called for. Unquote. And Price points out that the article has been reprinted in 3 different Levi-Strauss books, plus in a major anthology on comparative political systems that came out in the late 1960s. And the article is from the 40s, by the way. And the article is still cited in our times. For example, as I was trying to figure out what the story was with the Nambikwara chiefs, I found an article from 2015 on political leadership that referred to Levi-Strauss's article several times. And the focus of Levi-Strauss's article on the Nambikwara was all about the psychology of leadership and of the leader. He didn't really focus on the seasonal changes that he got wrong, and that Graeber and Wengrow got doubly wrong in Dawn of Everything. Anyhow, so here we get to one of the many parts of this book that makes me very angry. Quote, one reason for why Levi-Strauss's article disappeared is that in the post-war decades, Levi-Strauss was moving in exactly the opposite direction to the rest of his discipline. Where he emphasized similarities between the lives of hunters, horticulturalists, and modern industrial democracies, almost everyone else, and particularly everyone interested in foraging societies, was embracing new variations on Turgot, though with updated language and backed up by a flood of hard scientific data, throwing away old-fashioned distinctions between savagery, barbarism, and civilization, which were beginning to sound a little too condescending. They settled on a new sequence, which ran from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. The culmination of this trend was the landmark Man the Hunter Symposium, held at the University of Chicago in 1966. This framed hunter-gatherer studies in terms of a new discipline, which its attendees proposed to call behavioral ecology. Starting with rigorously quantified studies of African savanna and rainforest groups, the Kalahari San, Eastern Hadza, and Mbudi pygmies, including calorie counts, time allocation studies, and all sorts of data that simply hadn't been available to earlier researchers. Unquote. So, for all those assholes on Twitter and YouTube screaming at me that the authors aren't against materialism and that I'm strawmanning them and that they're only attacking popular writers, not anthropologists, behavioral ecology is materialist anthropology. It's the people who try to explain the behavior of human societies by looking at the environments and practical circumstances that we live in. It's where you find any serious scholar who's interested in figuring out what causes societies to be hierarchical or egalitarian, or what causes just about anything that people do. It's exactly what the authors should be doing, yet it's the target of their constant derision. And like I've been talking about through these book critique episodes, the Man the Hunter Conference is the conference that introduced anthropology, and also the popular reading public, to the fact that hyper-egalitarian and free societies actually exist. Democratic, gender egalitarian, anarcho-communist societies without political authority or gerontocracy, and without organized warfare. Things that Graeber and Wengrow should be deeply interested in, but that they insist on ignoring, or else they insist on attacking and dismissing. The conference happened right at the apex of the Cold War, when we were being told that you can have either equality or freedom, but you can't have both, and that equality is simply against human nature, and that any attempt to create an equal world will result in the horrors of Stalinism or the terror of the French Revolution. These are ideas that are still deeply, deeply ingrained in our minds. Like listen to any Jordan Peterson lecture, where he's freaking out about the left and the cultural Marxist, or any PragerU video. This is where these guys are coming from. This conference showed the world that not only can you have both liberty and equality, but that it was quite possible that most human beings were organized along libertarian and egalitarian lines for 90+% of our existence as a species. After all, human beings were all hunter-gatherers until about 12,000 years ago. And most hunter-gatherers are at least male egalitarian, and most foragers who practice the simplest type of economy that our earliest ancestors probably practiced are hyper-egalitarian with gender equality. The political implications of this were enormous, and left-wing anthropologists jumped all over it, while those inclined to the right had a tantrum and tried their best to dismiss or downplay it, much like Graeber and Wengrow do in this book, albeit for different reasons. Tellingly, the broader political left, which was more interested in authoritarian types of socialism, just ignored it, as did the broader political right and mainstream media for obvious reasons, kind of like everyone just ignored what the anarchists had accomplished in the Spanish Civil War. And as a result, outside of a brief flash, knowledge of this stuff has never really filtered into the general culture or even our political culture, which is something that I'm trying to correct with this series. Whereas for left-wing anthropologists, stuff like this was a revelation. For Graeber and Wengrow, this conference was just a giant festival of infantilizing hunter-gatherers. Quote, "The new studies overlapped with a sudden upswing of popular interest in just these same African societies. For instance, the famous short films about the Kalahari Bushmen by the Marshalls, an American family of anthropologists and filmmakers, which became fixtures of introductory anthropology courses and educational television across the world, along with best-selling books like Colin Turnbull's The Forest People." Unquote. Colin Turnbull's The Forest People. Now, this is just speculation, but to me, this one book just might be the key to understanding David Graeber's lifelong demented attitude towards hyper-egalitarian societies, and his weird belief that the theory of egalitarian ancestors, by definition, implies infantilism. The Forest People is a book written in 1961 for a popular audience about the Mbuti hunter-gatherers of the Ituri rainforest in Central Africa. The Mbuti are one of those immediate return hyper-egalitarian, gender-egalitarian societies that I'm always talking about. And even as hyper-egalitarian societies go, they're one of the most hyper-egalitarian, where women hunt together with men, and even older children can often make decisions that trump the will of adults, if it's something that will affect the future of the group, when today's kids will become tomorrow's adults. And much like Graeber and Wengrow are doing with The Dawn of Everything, Turnbull wrote The Forest People for a popular audience with a particular message in mind. In Turnbull's case, the message was that human equality and freedom are possible, and that we have a lot to learn about these things from societies like the Mbuti. And because Turnbull was trying to get that message across, and because the book was written for popular consumption, and because it was 1961, The Forest People reads a bit like a fairy tale. And it doesn't exactly ignore the various problems or difficulties of Mbuti life at the time, but it does portray Mbuti society a bit like a happy, harmonious Smurf village. So because of the romanticization, and also I guess because the Mbuti are a pygmy people who stand an average of 4 feet 11 inches tall, a modern reader might feel like The Forest People is infantilizing the Mbuti. And I can see why Graeber might react negatively to this book, and also to the annoying hippie professors and others who glommed onto it as an example of our Rousseauian Smurfy good nature, polluted by civilization, etc. To be honest, for all its various flaws, the forest people is what got me into anthropology. And I think that Colin Turnbull's work is really amazing in terms of describing how the material circumstances of different cultures shapes their lives and their different values and ideologies and relationships towards nature. And you see this really starkly with the hyper-egalitarian Mbudi foragers versus their hyper-patriarchal, witchcraft-obsessed, laissez horticultural neighbors. Anyhow, the authors continue. Quote, "Before long, it was simply assumed by almost everyone that foragers represented a separate stage of social development, that they live in small groups, move around a lot, reject any social distinctions other than those of age and gender, and resolve conflicts by fission rather than arbitration or violence." Unquote. And of course, the authors totally neglect to mention just how egalitarian these societies are, including gender egalitarianism, or just how important of a revelation that was at the time, and still is. Quote, "The fact that these African societies were, in some cases at least, refugee populations, living in places that no one else wanted, or that many foraging societies documented in the ethnographic record, who had by this time been largely wiped out by European settler colonialism, and were thus no longer available for quantitative analysis, were nothing like this. This was occasionally acknowledged, but it was rarely treated as particularly relevant. The image of tiny egalitarian bands corresponded perfectly to what those weaned on the legacy of Rousseau felt hunter-gatherers ought to have been like. Now, there seem to be hard, quantifiable scientific data, and also movies, to back it up." Unquote. Okay, now this is just shameful. Remember how I mentioned earlier that once the news about hyper-egalitarian societies made it out to the world, that the miserable cynics who hate the idea that humans could ever be egalitarians did everything they could to start attacking and downplaying everything about hunter-gatherer egalitarianism? Well, that whole paragraph comes straight out of that anti-egalitarian, miserable asshole talking points playbook. The thing about hyper-egalitarian foragers being refugees comes from the so-called Kalahari debate from the late 1980s and early 1990s, where a group of scholars centered around Edmund Wilmsen and James Denbo tried to reject just about everything that anthropologists had been writing about the various Kalahari hyper-egalitarian hunter-gatherers since the Man the Hunter Conference. With a particular mix of self-righteousness and cynicism, these scholars portrayed themselves as advanced realists and anti-racists, crusading against the essentialism of the supposed fantasy world created by hunter-gatherer specialists. And the underlying political message coming from these scholars was that categories are bad, and that human equality is some kind of rare, marginal phenomenon that didn't play a big role in human history or prehistory. According to these revisionist scholars, far from having anything to teach us in terms of how our ancestors lived, or in terms of the potential for human egalitarianism and liberty, the Kalahari Bushmen were actually just a bunch of sad losers. Not only were they not at all the original affluent society that hunter-gatherer specialists had been depicting, who enjoyed both equality and freedom thanks to their ancient foraging economy, but they weren't ancient, they weren't egalitarian, they weren't real foragers, and they weren't even a real society. According to the revisionists, the only reason that Bushmen were equal was because they were the equally oppressed lower loser classes of a larger society of pastoralists and farmers. And the only reason that they were foragers was because they had been forced to abandon pastoralism by stronger ethnic groups who had stolen all of their cattle and shoved them out into a crappy wasteland. Far from being a society that we can learn from, both their hunting and gathering economy and their equality were signs of degradation and subjugation, something that Turgot would have loved. And according to Denbo and Wilmsen and their allies, all of this was being obscured by the evil sin of categories. In other words, hierarchy and exploitation and misery are the norm of the human species. Jordan Peterson and PragerU can breathe a big sigh of relief. Unsurprisingly, most of these revisionist scholars have ended up on the wrong side of the more recent indigenous peoples debate, where they're not just rejecting the category of indigenous societies, but they've also been straight up supporting the eviction of Kalahari Bushmen and other peoples from their hunting lands, thereby supporting the destruction of these societies and their way of life in the name of progress and development. It's absolutely disgusting. Now, there's a ton of literature on the Kalahari debate and these claims going back and forth since the late 1980s. But for some reason, Graeber and Wengrow don't offer any citations to back up their statement about these people being refugees, etc., that whole paragraph that I just read. Maybe it's because the people who see the Bushmen as a real culture basically won that debate over time, and a big chunk of the revisionist argument was based on Wilmsen misreading the word onions as oxen in an old diary, which led him to mistakenly believe that the Bushmen used to have cattle until recent times. Or maybe it's because if you read any of the back and forth, you'll see that this looks like something of a left-right debate between people who think that equality is impossible and those who think that equality is possible, and the authors of Dawn of Everything are championing the politically wrong side of that argument. Or maybe they just forgot to put a citation. Who knows? But I know. Now, the whole thing about modern hunter-gatherers living on territories that historically nobody else wants, like savannas or rainforests or deserts or the Arctic. Now, that's certainly true. Hunter-gatherers are generally militarily weaker than pastoralist or agricultural societies because their population densities are so low, so they get easily displaced. But just because a territory is unsuitable for farming or pastoralism or agriculture doesn't mean that it's not a good foraging habitat. And every book about these societies by experts will remark on how forager groups are better fed and live a more enjoyable and materially secure lifestyle than their farmer and pastoralist neighbors, even when they're stressed for resources, right up until they get pushed out of foraging by capitalism or civil war or encroachment by militarily stronger societies, which is sadly the case now with the Kalahari foragers, who are no longer full-time foragers as of the past 10 years or so. The authors continue, quote, "In this new reality, Levi-Strauss's Nambikwara were simply irrelevant. After all, in evolutionary terms, they weren't even really foragers, since they only roamed about in foraging bands for 7 or 8 months a year. So the apparent paradox that their larger village settlements were egalitarian, while their foraging bands were anything but, needed to be ignored, lest it tarnish this crisp new picture. The kind of political self-consciousness which seemed so self-evident in Nambikwara chiefs, let alone the wild improvisation expected of Nuer prophets, had no place in the revised framework of human social evolution." Unquote. Another total garbage paragraph. Even if Levi-Strauss hadn't messed up about the Nambikwara having 2 separate modes of subsistence, there's no reason why the Nambikwara would be particularly relevant to what our early ancestors were doing. Our early ancestors weren't doing farming for 5 months of the year, or for any months of the year. And farming has really important practical and political implications. There are dozens of other societies that we'd want to look at for insights into our origins before we started looking at the Nambikwara. But Graeber and Wengrow think that we can generalize about our first African ancestors from 300,000 years ago by going on about Göbekli Tepe and about the European Ice Age. So, anything goes. Wiener, penis, Fiji. So, to summarize this section of the chapter, while the Nambikwara are certainly very interesting, the entire section on them in this book is just a giant waste of made-up garbage on top of made-up garbage on top of giant mistakes and bullshit strawman that doesn't teach us anything about anything besides what really bad scholarship looks like. Penis, wiener, penis, Fiji. Anyhow, from this complete waste of a section, the authors then go on to talk about societies that actually do change their social structures in terms of relative hierarchy or equality in different seasons. In particular, they talk about the Arctic Inuit and the Kwakiutl, or Kwakwak'wakw, as they're properly called, of the Pacific Northwest coast. And whereas earlier in the chapter, the authors tried to tell us that the rich burials of Upper Paleolithic Europe teach us that inequality has no origins, which implies that there was evidence of social hierarchy from those burials, in this part of the chapter, the authors tell us the exact opposite, that these burials actually aren't evidence of hierarchy at all, that they're just ritually celebrated freaks with unusual bodies or birth defects, who come from societies that had seasonal variations where people were dispersed into hunting groups part of the year and then congregated en masse for another part of the year, like the fictionalized version of the Nambikwara that the authors just described. Quote, "Let's return to those rich Upper Paleolithic burials, so often interpreted as evidence for the emergence of, quote, inequality, or even hereditary nobility of some sort. For some odd reason, those who make such arguments never seem to notice, or if they do, to attach much significance to the fact, that a quite remarkable number of these skeletons, indeed a majority, bear evidence of striking physical anomalies that could only have marked them out clearly and dramatically from their social surroundings. The adolescent boys in both Sungir and Dolny Vestonice, for instance, had pronounced congenital deformities. The bodies in the Romito cave in Calabria were unusually short, with at least one case of dwarfism. while those in Grimaldi Cave were extremely tall, even by our standards, and must have seemed like veritable giants to their contemporaries. All this seems very unlikely to have been a coincidence. It makes us wonder whether even those bodies which appear from their skeletal remains to be anatomically typical might have been equally striking in some other way. After all, an albino, for example, or an epileptic prophet given to dividing his time between hanging upside down and arranging and rearranging snail shells would not be identifiable as such from the archaeological record. It seems extremely unlikely that Paleolithic Europe produced a stratified elite that just happened to consist largely of hunchbacks, giants, and dwarfs. There are any number of other interpretations that could be placed on the evidence, though the idea that these tombs mark the emergence of some sort of hereditary aristocracy seems the least likely of all." Unquote. So the authors see these rich burials not as evidence of hierarchy, but as something like Nuer prophets, anomalous people that are given some kind of special status as a result of their strangeness. And then the authors tie this into seasonality. Quote, "Almost all the Ice Age sites with extraordinary burials and monumental architecture." And remember that we saw last time that they just made this stuff up. There are precisely 0 Ice Age sites with anything that we could call monumental architecture. Anyways, quote, "These sites were created by societies that lived a little like Levi-Strauss's Nambikwara, dispersing into foraging bands at one time of the year, gathering together in concentrated settlements at another. This seems to be the explanation for those hubs of activity found in Eastern Europe at places like Dolny Vestonice, where people took advantage of an abundance of wild resources to feast, engage in complex rituals and ambitious artistic projects, and trade minerals, marine shells, and furs. Archaeology also shows us that patterns of seasonal variation lie behind the monuments of Göbekli Tepe." Unquote. And then the authors talk about how Stonehenge was built by people who abandoned farming to do foraging and pastoralism, which they act like that's supposed to be some kind of game-changing big deal, and how these Stonehenge people had a seasonal structure too, which, okay, great. Stonehenge was built 5,000 years ago by Neolithic pastoralists, so I have no idea what this has to do with anything. If you read carefully, you see that just like the earlier part about Paleolithic inequality, this whole section is a lot of smoke and mirrors. Like, what do Nuer prophets or Paleolithic dwarves or albinos have anything to do with seasonal social structures? Nuer prophets were totally unrelated to Nuer seasonal patterns. The Kwakiutl and the Inuit had pronounced seasonal settlement and social patterns, but they didn't have special seasonal leaders and they didn't revere freaks. The Paleolithic freaks theory might be valid, but there's literally no connection between that or the Nuer or the Inuit or the Kwakiutl. Anyways, then the authors connect these European Ice Age burials to the author's thesis that social structure is some kind of discombobulated conscious choice. Quote, "Recall that for Levi-Strauss, there was a clear link between seasonal variations of social structure and a certain kind of political freedom. The fact that one structure applied in the rainy season and another in the dry allowed Nambikwara chiefs to view their own social arrangements at one remove, to see them as not simply given, in the natural order of things, but as something at least partially open to human intervention." Unquote. And of course, Levi-Strauss says absolutely nothing of the sort. Just like they did with Christopher Boehm last time, the authors are turning Levi-Strauss into a Muppet and making him say things that he never said. "Hey, Bert. Hey, I ate all the cookies, Bert. People choose their form of social organization because of conscious choice, Bert." And they continue. Quote, "Writing in the midst of the Second World War, Levi-Strauss probably didn't think he was saying anything all that extraordinary. For anthropologists in the first half of the 20th century, it was common knowledge that societies doing a great deal of hunting, herding, or foraging were often arranged in such a double morphology, as Levi-Strauss's great predecessor, Marcel Mauss, put it. Levi-Strauss was simply highlighting some of the political implications." Unquote. That's correct. He wasn't saying anything super extraordinary, then or now. That article is only interesting in terms of the psychology of the chief, which is what that article is about. But back to the authors. Quote, "But these political implications are important. What the existence of similar seasonal patterns in the Paleolithic suggests is that from the very beginning, or at least as far back as we can trace such things, human beings were self-consciously experimenting with different social possibilities. It might be useful here to look back at this forgotten anthropological literature, with which Levi-Strauss would have been intimately familiar, to get a sense of just how dramatic these seasonal differences might be." Unquote. So, Where the authors were making shit up about the Nambikwara and wasting my life, here they do come up with some actual examples of seasonal variations in the level of hierarchy or equality of a society. And there is a lot that we can learn from this, if we focus on all of the things that Graeber and Wengrow deliberately choose to ignore. Quote, the key text here is Marcel Mauss and Henri Beuchat's 1903 Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo. The authors begin by observing that circumpolar Inuit, and likewise many other societies, have two social structures, one in summer and one in winter, and that in parallel they have two systems of law and religion. In the summer, Inuit disperses into bands of roughly 20 or 30 people to pursue freshwater fish, caribou, and reindeer, all under the authority of a single male elder. During this period, property was possessively marked, and patriarchs exercised coercive and sometimes even tyrannical power over their kin, much more so than the Nambikwara chiefs in the dry season. But in the long winter months, when seals and walrus flocked to the Arctic shore, there was a dramatic reversal. Then, Inuit gathered together to build great meeting houses of wood, whale rib, and stone. Within these houses, virtues of equality, altruism, and collective life prevailed. Wealth was shared, and husbands and wives exchanged partners under the aegis of Sedna, the goddess of the sea." Unquote. Okay, so most of this is accurate, except that I have no idea where they get the part about summer bands being organized around 20 to 30 people under a single male leader. It's definitely not in the book that they're referencing, the Marcel Mauss, and I tried looking elsewhere, but I didn't find anything. So maybe it's true, or maybe they just made it up. If you know the answer, feel free to let me know. But in any case, what Marcel Mauss actually says about summer settlement size is that, quote, "From one end of the Eskimo area to the other, this group," meaning the settlement, "consists of a family, defined in the narrowest sense of the word, a man and his wife, or if there is room, his wives, plus their unmarried children. In exceptional cases, a tent may include an older relative or a widow who has not remarried and her children, or a guest or two." Unquote. So, these aren't settlements made up of individual families. The settlements are just individual families, quote, "located at a considerable distance from each other," unquote. But anyhow, the authors continue, quote, "Mauss thought that the Inuit were an ideal case study because living in the Arctic, they were facing some of the most extreme environmental constraints it was possible to endure. Yet even in subarctic conditions, Mauss calculated that physical considerations, availability of game, building materials, and the like, explained at best 40% of the picture. Other circumpolar peoples, he noted, including close neighbors of the Inuit facing near identical physical conditions, organized themselves quite differently. To a large extent, he concluded, Inuit lived the way that they did because they felt that that's how humans ought to live." Unquote. And that seems to be the author's idea of how any society is organized, just how they think that they should live. Now, 40%, he mentions, that's a very specific number. It'd be interesting to see how Mauss got at that figure, that only 40% of their social structure and ideas can be traced back to material conditions. Did he do some kind of data analysis, or was this just some sort of guesstimate? If you read the book that the authors are referring to, drum roll, Marcel Mauss never says anything about 40% of anything, ever. The authors just straight up made this shit up. "Hey Bert, I made up some numbers, Bert. 69, Bert." Not only that, but more importantly, Mauss basically says the exact opposite of what the authors are trying to say here. What Mauss actually says, and he sounds a lot like a proto-behavioral ecologist, is that these seasonal differences between the Inuit social organization and their cultural practices are almost entirely explained by material conditions, specifically the migration patterns of the animals that they hunt. Quote, "We must look to the Eskimo way of life for the causes of this situation," meaning their dual settlement patterns and their social cultural structure. "Indeed, this is not at all difficult to understand. It is, on the contrary, a remarkable application of the laws of biophysics and the necessary symbiotic relation among animal species. European explorers have frequently insisted that even with European equipment, there is no better diet nor better economic system in these regions than that adopted by the Eskimo. They are governed by environmental circumstances." In summary, summer opens up an almost unlimited area for hunting and fishing, while winter narrowly restricts this area. This alternation provides the rhythm of concentration and dispersion for the morphological organization of the Eskimo society. The population congregates or scatters like the game. The movement that animates Eskimo society is synchronized with that of the surrounding life." Unquote. The only thing that Mauss points to that animal migration patterns don't explain is why the Inuit choose to live specifically in multi-family igloos instead of living in separate houses in the winter, and why they build assembly houses, which the authors ludicrously called monumental architecture when referring to the Paleolithic versions of these types of small buildings. Quote, "The natives could have placed their tents side by side, or they could have constructed small houses instead of living in family groups under the same roof. One ought not to forget that the kashim, or men's house, and the large house, where several branches of the same family reside, are not confined to the Eskimo. They are found among other peoples, and consequently cannot be the result of special features unique to the organization of these northern societies. They have to be related in part to certain characteristics that Eskimo culture has in common with these other cultures." So basically Mauss is giving a historical argument for that. And Mauss doesn't say that other circumpolar people were organized quite differently. Mauss does say that some Inuit had contact with the Athabascans and Algonquins as trading partners, and that the Inuit would have benefited from adopting Athabascan snowshoes instead of waterproof boots that they used, but that they refused to do so. But Mauss doesn't say anything about the Algonquin or Athabascan social organization one way or another, so again, all of this stuff is just fake news. Anyhow, then the authors talk about the cultural and legal differences that you find in traditional Inuit society from summer to winter. Quote, "Many aspects of winter life reversed the values of summer. In the summer, for instance, property rights were clearly asserted and sometimes physically inscribed onto personal objects, especially hunting weapons. But in the communalistic atmosphere of the winter house, generosity trumped accumulation as a route to personal prestige. The right of male patriarchs to coerce their sons, and indeed the group as a whole, was acknowledged only in the summer months. It had no place around the winter hearth, where the principles of Inuit leadership were turned on their head. Legitimate authority became a matter of charisma rather than birthright, persuasion instead of coercion." Unquote. And another important change from season to season that Mauss discusses, but that Graeber and Wengrow don't get into, is that the Inuit barely had any religious life in the summer, meaning that they didn't observe many rituals or taboos, but in the winter they have a rich religious and ritual life with many rules to be observed. So then the authors argue that all these seasonal differences are because of conscious choice and awareness of different political possibilities, blah, 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 which of course Mauss doesn't say anything about at all in his book. So how can we better explain these important cultural differences from season to season? And what does Mauss have to say about them? While Mauss tells us that the dual social structure of the Inuit is the result of the seasonal dispersal patterns of the animals that they hunt, he doesn't really give us any specific reasons for how that translates into patriarchy and private property in one season versus gender equality and communalism in the other season. So let's use our materialist-trained noggins to see what we can figure out. So remember that according to Mauss, the Inuit all congregate together in winter because the seals and walrus they hunt are all clustered in one area each year. And in the summer, they separate into individual families because the animals that they hunt and the foods that they gather are widely dispersed. This gives us the information that we need to figure out some pretty parsimonious answers to what's going on. So for example, property relations. Why was there more private property in the summer versus more communal property in the winter? Well, hunting and gathering and fishing in the summer are mostly an individual affair. So you have your individual stuff and there's nobody really to share it with except your immediate family. In the winter, hunting is communal, so people depend on each other and share their catches and use each other's property. And there are lots of people around who you want to maintain good relations with. And also there are a lot of people around who have leverage to pressure you into sharing with them. So there are many more reasons and incentives to share and people to share with versus in the very isolated and lonely summer season. What about religion? While some religions like Western Protestantism are more of an individual affair, in most traditional societies, religion is largely a communal affair, and it's often more about establishing different kinds of social relations and ties and values and boundaries than about specific beliefs. You don't really need as many practices and rituals if you're just with your family. Anyone who's done an elaborate 3-hour Passover Seder, wherein a lot of different guests are present, with songs and readings and spraying wine and throwing rubber frogs at each other, versus a 5-minute version with just mom and dad and siblings, Baruch Atah Adonai, Passover, let's eat. If you've had that experience, you know what I'm talking about. And how do Inuit settlement patterns explain differences in gender relations? The authors want us to believe that the Inuit consciously understood that they had many social possibilities and that they chose patriarchy in the summer and equality in the winter as opposed to us, who are stuck. Well, here's a description of Inuit gender relations from a book called Inuit Women by Janet Mancini-Bilson and Kira Mancini. Quote, "Life was hard for the Inuk woman, as one elder recalls. She was the first to rise and the last to sleep. Her husband was always right. She could be punished by her parents for not pleasing her husband. In terms of power distribution, the husband was clearly the head of the family. He had the final word, and that's just the way it was. The Inuit tended to accept the principle of ultimate male authority, as an elder recalls. The man was the boss. All the men." Unquote. Now, this sounds to me like Inuit women were actually pretty stuck in gender hierarchy. Did women consciously choose this situation over and over every single summer because it's some kind of fun, kinky SM game to play subservient wife? Or because of some random Inuit values that just emerge out of the mysterious extraterrestrial Inuit mind? Obviously not. Men imposed this on women and women tolerated it. So what are the conditions that gave men the advantage to be able to impose this on women in the summer, but not in the winter? Remember the two criteria for hierarchy: control over resources and people having no better alternatives to access those resources. Well, in the summer, traditional Inuit women were living in single-family units, where they were almost entirely dependent for survival on their fathers and brothers who did all of the hunting. And father and brothers were probably physically stronger than they were. And on top of that, they were hoarding their hunting weapons as private property, not to be shared with their wives or daughters. Meanwhile, Inuit tents, as we saw, were at a large distance from one another in the summer, so it's hard to escape, and there isn't really any great place to escape to. Since everyone is busy feeding their immediate families and chasing very dispersed resources, it's a significant imposition to suddenly show up at your brother's house and to be another mouth to feed so that everyone gets 15 to 20% less food thanks to you. In other words, the conditions inherent to the economic activities of summer put men at a general bargaining power advantage vis-a-vis women. Now, women still had a decent amount of bargaining power, and Bilson and Mancini point out that men could not survive without female labor either. So if need be, a woman could play a dangerous game of brinksmanship to get concessions out of men. But a lot of cultural norms specifically exist to avoid these chaotic and dangerous power struggles, which can end in catastrophe for the winners as well as for the losers. That's why a woman's parents would punish her for being disobedient, because in the long run it could mean death for her and her kids and her husband as well. If there's a physical fight, the man will likely win, but it's extremely dangerous to ever let it get anywhere near that point when you're all alone for several months with only your immediate family. That's why Inuit culture is famously extremely averse to any expressions of anger, even more so than other hunter-gatherers, many of whom share that same cultural trait. And contrary to the idea of conscious choice, the whole point of cultural rules is usually to avoid conscious choices, to avoid individuals making calculations that may seem like they're in our interest in the short term, but that will doom us or the wider group in the long term. Think about kosher laws against eating swine. Marvin Harris noted that the laws against eating swine exist not only in the Middle East among Jews and Muslims, but also in other regions around the world. And what these cultures share in common is that in those areas, it's only possible to feed pigs with the same foods that humans eat. If only some people raise pigs, or if it's a good harvest that year, raising pigs is a great idea to improve your farmer diet. But once everyone starts to do it, or when harvests are bad, suddenly you end up with massive food shortages, and starvation, and class war between pig owners and non-pig owners, and chaos and social collapse. If you depend on people's individual rational choices, then everyone will want to raise pigs, even if they know it might kill them in the long run. So it's more effective to make it a deeply ingrained religious and social taboo, where the actual cause is obscured and people just don't even consider it in the first place. So presumably, after a few rounds of pig-caused famines, people in these areas develop these taboos, just like the Inuit must have developed patriarchal values after repeated power struggles causing chaos. Over time, as a result of some of these battles, the values of the society end up reflecting the balance of powers of that society, determining the winner in advance in order to avoid constant battles. Meanwhile, in the winter, the Inuit lived in multi-family homes in large settlements with many homes close together. This means that both men and women had their relatives around, and women in particular had male relatives around. That means that if anyone tried to bully a woman, her brothers and father and uncles would have something to say about it. Also, any woman will likely have close relatives and friends around that she can move in with if she wants to get away from an annoying husband or just divorce him. I think that these explanations are much more parsimonious and insightful than decontextualized conscious choice and experimenting with social possibilities. Now the authors move south, from the Arctic to the Great Plains of North America. Quote, Plains nations were one-time farmers who had largely abandoned cereal agriculture after re-domesticating escaped Spanish horses and adopting a largely nomadic mode of life. Unquote. Then the authors continue discussing the observations of early 20th century anthropologist Robert Lowy. Quote, In late summer and early autumn, small and highly mobile bands of Cheyenne and Lakota would congregate in large settlements to make logistical preparations for the buffalo hunt. At this most sensitive time of year, they appointed a police force that exercised full coercive powers, including the right to imprison, whip, or fine any offender who endangered the proceedings. Yet, as Lowy observed, this unequivocal authoritarianism operated on a strictly seasonal and temporary basis. Once the hunting season and the collective Sundance rituals that followed were complete, such authoritarianism gave way to what he called anarchic forms of organization, society splitting once again into small, mobile bands. Lowy's observations here are startling. And then here they quote Lowy. Quote, In order to ensure a maximum kill, a police force, either coinciding with a military club or appointed ad hoc, or serving by virtue of clan affiliation, issued orders and restrained the disobedient. In most of the tribes, they not only confiscated game clandestinely procured, but whipped the offender, destroyed his property, and in case of resistance, killed him. The very same organization which in a murder case would merely use moral suasion turned into an inexorable state agency during a buffalo drive. However, coercive measures extended considerably beyond the hunt. The soldiers also forcibly restrained braves intent on starting war parties that were deemed inopportune by the chief. They directed mass migrations, supervised the crowds at a major festival, and might otherwise maintain law and order. And then Graeber and Wengrow continue. Quote, During a large part of the year, Lowy continued, the tribe simply did not exist as such, and the families or minor unions of familiars that jointly sought a living required no special disciplinary organization. The soldiers were thus a concomitant of numerically strong aggregations, hence functioned intermittently rather than continuously. But the soldier sovereignty, he stressed, was no less real for its temporary nature. As a result, Lowy insisted that Plains Indians did in fact know something of state power, even though they never actually developed a state. Unquote. In other words, if you read this the right way, the reason that you had police force part of the year, but then no enforcement even of murder for the rest of the year, is not because of random conscious choices about political possibilities, but because during the buffalo hunt, you aggregated in big enough numbers to actually have a force capable of enforcing rules, which was not the case in the rest of the year. As Lowy says, the tribe simply did not exist for much of the rest of the year, as people were dispersed into small groups to pursue seasonally dispersed resources, somewhat similar to the Inuit, but with larger small bands, not just isolated families. I'm suspicious of Lowy saying that small bands didn't require disciplinary organization. The fact that Lowy talks about a murder case being dealt with moral suasion suggests to me that they did need discipline, but that you had no one to enforce it. In a small band setting, it becomes really dangerous to punish or kill someone, even a murderer, because it can turn into a feud and destroy your ability to survive. This is why most hunting and gathering societies have strict rules about anger and expressions of violence. People would like to control murderers during the off-season, but they can't do it effectively. In his article, Lowy compares this seasonal change to the seasonal changes of the Inuit as described by Mauss. And like Mauss, Lowy attributes social change to economic and logistic factors, not Graeber's shroom hyperconsciousness. The authors continue, writing as if this stuff breaks the mold of strawman anthropology. Quote, It was confusing enough that people like the Nambikwara seemed to jump back and forth over the course of the year between economic categories. The Cheyenne, Crow, Assiniboine, or Lakota would appear to jump regularly from one end of the political spectrum to the other. They were a kind of band-state amalgam. In other words, they threw everything askew. And speaking of horses, here the authors get in their high horse mode. Quote, Scholarship does not always advance. Sometimes it slips backwards. 100 years ago, most social scientists understood that those who live mainly from wild resources were not normally restricted to tiny, quote, bands. As we've seen, the assumptions that they were only gained ground in the 1960s, unquote. There are zillions of articles discussing all the different types of hunter-gatherers and their different types of social organization. See Robert Kelly's book, The Foraging Spectrum, for example. And there are tons of articles debating the implications of hierarchical versus egalitarian hunter-gatherers on what life was like for our early ancestors. It's a huge literature that Graeber and Wengrow seem to have no curiosity or awareness about whatsoever. It is true that in the 1960s, people paid less attention to non-egalitarian foragers, or to less egalitarian foragers, because everyone was so excited about discovering the existence of hyper-egalitarian foragers, and the very hopeful and inspiring possibility that humanity may have egalitarian origins, and that we might be best suited to live in egalitarian societies. The authors continue, quote, "Since in this new evolutionist narrative, states were defined above all by their monopoly on the legitimate use of coercive force, the 19th century Cayenne or Lakota would have been seen as evolving from the band level to the state level roughly every November, and then devolving back again come spring. Obviously, this is silly. No one would seriously suggest such a thing. Still, it's worth pointing out, because it exposes the much deeper silliness of the initial assumption, that societies must necessarily progress through a series of evolutionary stages to begin with. You can't speak of an evolution from band to tribe to chiefdom to state if your starting points are groups that move fluidly between them as a matter of habit." Unquote. Again, what's silly is pretending that anthropologists from the 1960s and 70s were time-warped in from the 1860s and 70s. A social evolutionist would not be freaked out by the Lakota police. They'd be interested in thinking about whether or not that type of institution might eventually get stuck and turn into an authoritarian system. And they'd be wondering if some authoritarian chieftainships, which we've seen in recent times, might have had their origins in this type of institution in the past. And Lowy actually talks about this briefly. And legitimate use of coercive force is not a new evolutionist definition, it's Max Weber from 1919. Social evolutionists and anthropologists and archaeologists are always trying to come up with a better definition of the state. It's one of those words that no one agrees on exactly what it means, and that I really need to do an episode on. Anyhow, the authors go on. Quote, "Seasonal dualism also throws into chaos more recent efforts at classifying hunter-gatherers into either simple or complex types, since what have been identified as the diagnostic features of complexity, territoriality, social ranks, material wealth, or competitive display, appear during certain seasons of the year, only to be brushed aside in others by the exact same population." Unquote. Now this is embarrassing. No, that doesn't throw anything into disarray at all. I don't like the simple versus complex categories, but regardless of that, the term complex hunter-gatherers was specifically invented to describe the Pacific Northwest Coast people like the Kwakiutl who switch social structures back and forth seasonally, and much more dramatically so than the Inuit or the fake Nambikwara did. And these seasonal cultures don't consciously choose to brush aside those institutions. Those institutions, like we saw with the Lakota, evaporate as soon as the society moves on to an economic activity that is physically incompatible with maintaining those institutions, even when it would be preferable to do so. The authors continue, quote, "Admittedly, most professional anthropologists nowadays have come to recognize that these categories are hopelessly inadequate, but the main effect of this acknowledgement has just been to cause them to change the subject, or suggest that perhaps we shouldn't really be thinking about the broad sweep of human history at all anymore. Nobody has yet proposed an alternative." Unquote. So here I sort of agree with them in that the categories that we have are not very well developed, and good alternatives, or rather elaborations on the categories that we've been using, are in order. And I'll talk about these categories and the problems with them another time. But what's relevant here is that instead of developing better categories, the authors seem to just want to throw away all the categories and lie on the carpet shrooming about the oneness of everything, leaving us unable to understand anything about why we are currently stuck in hierarchy. Okay. So now the authors bring it all back home, and they link the cultures that they've been talking about to the Ice Age European burials that they've talked about at the beginning of the chapter. Quote, Meanwhile, as we've seen, archaeological evidence is piling up to suggest that in the highly seasonal environments of the last ice age, our remote ancestors were behaving much like the Inuit, Nambikwara, or Crow. They shifted back and forth between alternative social arrangements, building monuments, not true, and then closing them down again, allowing the rise of authoritarian structures during certain times of the year, and then dismantling them. None of those cultures did this, except the Lakota, all, it would seem, on the understanding that no particular social order was ever fixed or immutable." Unquote. So, at the beginning of this chapter, they use the rich burials of Upper Paleolithic Europe to suggest that inequality has no origin. But then, 5 minutes ago, they tell us that they're not actually signs of inequality at all, but rather they just show reverence for freaks. But now they're telling us that they were in fact building authoritarian structures. So I guess that means that there are signs of inequality because they don't give us any other reason to think that Paleolithic Europeans were building authoritarian structures. And notice how if you want to take any of this seriously, that it implies that people are saying, okay, it's winter, let's do patriarchy. Ooh, it's summer, let's do gender equality. Oh, it's the dry season, let's not punish murderers anymore. But now that it's the buffalo season, we should police murderers and everything else. And it's completely incorrect to say that these societies made all of these shifts, quote, on the understanding that no particular social order was ever fixed or immutable, unquote. Because their social orders were about as fixed and as immutable as our own. Every single winter, the Inuit had patriarchy. Every single summer, they had more gender equality. Every single year, the Plains tribes had a hard time punishing murderers, but every single buffalo season, they could enforce those rules. If these social systems were just random choice, or about some kind of mysterious internal cultural logic that the authors and the sources that they cite all forgot to tell us about, well, then why is it always men who dominate Inuit in the summer instead of taking turns with the women? Why doesn't any culture ever have a different system every season, or every year? Why don't they cycle through 15 different seasons with 15 different social structures? Why are they always stuck with just the same two patterns over and over? The reason is because in different seasons, different environmental and economic conditions, which mostly repeat every single year, change the balance of powers of various actors, which results in different social structures and different institutions and practices. There are all sorts of things that we need to think about and understand if we want to identify and modify the causes of hierarchy in our society. And these are the sorts of things that the authors insist on de-emphasizing and ignoring and inventing things about over and over. Okay, so now at the end of the third chapter of the book, the authors pose their big thesis question in this section, which is titled, quote, "Why the real question is not what are the origins of social inequality, but rather how did we get stuck?" And they tell us that, quote, "If we are right, and if human beings really have spent most of the last 40,000 years or so moving back and forth between different forms of social organization, building up hierarchies and then dismantling them again, the implications are profound." And what were they doing for the first 200,000 years before that, though? Don't think about it, Bert. Quote, "For one thing, it suggests that Pierre Clastres was quite right when he proposed that rather than being less politically self-conscious than people nowadays, people in stateless societies might actually have been considerably more so." Unquote. Okay, so that I can totally get behind. Yes, people in smaller scale traditional societies have to be more politically conscious than we are because they have direct involvement in their political systems for the most part, or close involvement. Traditional people very often are the political system. They are their government, i.e. the people who make and enforce rules, or else they have at least continual direct contact with the people who do, be it chiefs, or their husbands, or parents, or clan mothers, or buffalo police. We, on the other hand, who vote once every few years, can live our lives having no contact with our political decision makers and no idea how they actually do anything. And even if we spend all our day on the internet researching it, we still might have no actual experience engaging with it. And where we do constantly engage with politics and government, in the family, the workplace, and school, and the private sphere, the words politics and government are commonly defined in our society in such a way that we don't even conceive of any of this stuff as politics, and so we sleepwalk right through it. This is why people think that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are rescuing the world from the lizard people, New World Order, pedophiles, Agenda 69, Bill Gates, biolab, or whatever else. I'd also say that traditional people are not only more politically conscious than we are, but that they're often more materially conscious than we are. They're more conscious of the material conditions that generate their cultural practices, and also of the power imbalances that they benefit from or suffer from. Like if you ask any peasant in rural China, they'll tell you that patriarchal residence is one of the reasons why women are so devalued in their society. Or if you ask a Central African forager and farmer about why their cultures and values are so different from each other, they'll point out to you that it has a lot to do with their economic activities, as per Colin Turnbull. And speaking of categories, a Bilo farmer in Central Africa, speaking to Jerome Lewis, spontaneously explained the differences between his culture and the neighboring egalitarian Mbengele hunter-gatherers, specifically in terms of immediate versus delayed return categories that hunter-gatherer specialists use. These people certainly have a way better understanding of what causes hierarchy in their societies than the two PhD scholars who wrote Dawn of Everything do. And here the authors switch to the Kwakwak'wakw, who anthropologists have been calling the Kwakiutl. And they're one of the famous Pacific Northwest coast societies that I've discussed a few times, who were hunter-gatherers, but who also had an elaborate hierarchy with chiefs and different social classes, commoners, nobility, and slaves. And they also had a seasonal social structure. And this time the authors are basing themselves on the work of Franz Boas, who lived and wrote about the Kwakiutl at the turn of the century. Quote, "Here, Boas discovered, it was winter, not summer, that was the time when society crystallized into its most hierarchical forms, and spectacularly so. Plank-built palaces sprang to life along the coastline of British Columbia, with hereditary nobles holding court over compatriots classified as commoners and slaves, and hosting the great banquets known as potlatch. Yet these aristocratic courts broke apart for the summer work of the fishing season, reverting to smaller clan formations, still ranked, but with entirely different and much less formal social structures. In this case, people actually adopted different names in summer and winter, literally becoming someone else, depending on the time of year." Unquote. And then they ask, why did scholars ignore this phenomenon, even the anarchist Clastres? Kind of like I always ask, why did anarchist David Graeber totally ignore all of the gender egalitarian anarcho-communist societies for his entire career until now? Quote, "The answer is probably a simple one. Seasonality was confusing. In fact, it's kind of a wild card. The societies of the Great Plains created structures of coercive authority that lasted throughout the entire season of hunting, and the rituals that followed, but those of central Brazil dispersed into foraging bands as a way of asserting a political authority that was ineffectual in village settings." Unquote. What? The authors literally just said that the reason that the Nambikwara dispersed into small bands was, quote, "as a way of asserting political authority," unquote. Like not, oh, we need to obey a leader in order to be efficient hunters and survive the dangers of this season. But they want us to think that the Nambikwara were thinking, gee, all this equality is so boring. What can we do to have more fun political authority in our lives? I know, why don't we ditch our productive farms and split up into small groups chasing snakes and small animals on the edge of starvation for 7 months, which is how Levi-Strauss describes the hunting season. This is what I mean by this book makes its readers stupid. And they continue. Quote, "Among the Inuit, fathers ruled in the summertime, but in winter gatherings, patriarchal authority and even norms of sexual propriety were challenged, subverted, or simply melted away." By the way, if you're Inuit and you wanted to have sex outside of marriage in the traditional summer, the main options you would have been to have sex with your mom or dad or your brothers and sisters, or if you're really lucky, your aunt, because there was no one else nearby. Like, gee, I wonder why they didn't do that. Anyhow, back to why seasonality is supposedly confusing to strawman anthropologists. Quote, "The Kwakiutl were hierarchical at both times of year, but nonetheless maintained different forms of hierarchy, giving effective police powers to performers in the midwinter ceremonial, the bear dancers and fool dancers, that could be exercised only during the actual performance of the ritual. At other times, aristocrats commanded great wealth, but couldn't give their followers direct orders. Many Central African forager societies are egalitarian all year round, but appear to alternate monthly between a ritual order dominated by men and another dominated by women. In other words, there is no single pattern. The only consistent phenomenon is the very fact of alteration and the consequent awareness of different social possibilities. What all this confirms is searching for, quote, the origins of social inequality really is asking the wrong question." Unquote. No patterns, no categories, nothing happens for any reasons except choice and free will because we exist entirely in our minds like a giant video game and not in the real world. As I pointed out in the last episode, the relevant conditions to hierarchy or equality are not about winter versus summer or forest versus savanna, but about what activities you do in those environments and what balance of powers results from that. Many cultures, like the Inuit, disperse in the summer and aggregate in the winter. Why? It's not because of random choices and shroom consciousness, and it's not because summer causes dispersal, whatever that means, but because food is more sparse in hotter weather, and animals disperse, and there are less concentrations of things like fruits or edible insects. And whereas for the Inuit, the time of congregating together was a time of more equality, for the reasons that we looked at, for the Kwakiutl, the village was where class hierarchy was the most important, because the chief would be redistributing food in potlatch feasts, according to class. The higher you rank, the more you got. So you end up with the opposite pattern of the Inuit. But that's precisely because of material conditions, not in spite of them, like Graeber and Wengrow want us to believe. And the thing about the African forager societies, where they're egalitarian all year round, but men and women alternate in dominating the ritual order every new moon, that's a reference to the Mbengele of Central Africa. And the authors attribute this to Chris Knight, but it's actually the work of Morna Finnegan, which I'll link to. And I'll talk about it another time because it's super important in terms of how equality is maintained in a society with potentially competing groups, like men versus women. And again, the Kwakiutl were as stuck as anyone, with the same structures repeating year after year. So yes, there is one single pattern, and it's that material conditions shape social structures and customs. Okay, now we get to the big question of the whole book, which the authors never answer because they're so dedicated to not understanding where hierarchy comes from. Quote, "If human beings, through most of our history, have moved back and forth fluidly between different social arrangements, assembling and dismantling hierarchies on a regular basis, maybe the real question should be, how did we get stuck? How did we end up in one single mode? How did we lose that political self-consciousness, once so typical of our species? How did we come to treat eminence and subservience not as temporary expedients, or even the pomp and circumstance of some kind of grand seasonal theater, but as inescapable elements of the human condition? If we started out just playing games, at what point did we forget that we were playing?" Unquote. Boom! So there it is right in the author's thesis statement. To the authors, the hierarchy that they've been describing to us is just grand theater. It's playing games and expedience. Inuit women are subservient, and Kwakiutl lower classes eat less food, and slaves do all the dirty work because they're just playing games. Or somehow it's expedient? For whom? And the reason that we're stuck in hierarchy today isn't because of material conditions. It's because we all became morons who forgot that we were just playing these awesome, super fun hierarchy video games. Now, the idea of temporary expedience as a reason for seasonal hierarchy, which the authors mention along with play and theater, that would actually make sense if we were talking about democratic hierarchies, like the Nambikwara chieftainship. But the hierarchies that we're stuck in today are dominance hierarchies, so the idea of expedience does not really help us, unless we want to explore the different ways that a democratic hierarchy can slide into dominance hierarchy in the right circumstances. And there's a whole literature on that, and it's super interesting. But of course, the authors won't touch it with the 10-foot pole because it means looking at circumstances. So instead, we get 700 pages of doggerel about nothing. Now, it's really easy to get confused by ridiculous explanations for the practices of people in traditional cultures, because we tend to think of these people as foreign and exotic, especially the way that the authors describe their practices out of context from the circumstances that they take place in. But just imagine if someone was making these sorts of claims about our society. No society demonstrates the power of political consciousness more than the members of the MacDonald's tribe, who shift from hierarchy to equality every week and even every day. Workers and managers and franchise owners and corporate executives all form a strict chain of command with extreme political inequality. The low-ranking workers have to obey dictates on how to dress and how to act and what they can say and can't say. And if they disobey, they are at the mercy of their managers, who can eject them from the tribe and even leave them to fend for themselves, facing eviction from their homes and starvation. But then, every weekend, and at the end of every shift, outside of the grounds of the Holy MacDonald's monumental architecture, even the godlike CEO chief has no power over the lowliest janitor. If they see each other at the grocery store or going for a walk in the hills, they greet each other as equal citizens. What's happening here is that McDonald's workers understand different political possibilities, and they're assembling and dismantling hierarchies for games and grand theater and expedience on a weekly and even daily basis. That is how stupid this chapter is. But we buy into it because we don't know enough about the cultures that they describe and because they don't give us any context. And the authors finally conclude this shit show of a chapter with the following. Quote, "We do not have to choose anymore between an egalitarian or hierarchical start to the human story. Let us bid farewell to the childhood of man, and acknowledge, as Levi-Strauss insisted, that our early ancestors were not just our cognitive equals, but our intellectual peers too. Likely as not, they grappled with the paradoxes of social order and creativity just as much as we do, and understood them, at least the most reflexive among them, just as much, which also means just as little. They were perhaps more aware of some things and less aware of others. They were neither ignorant savages nor wise sons and daughters of nature. They were, as Elena Valero said of the Yanomami, just people like us, equally perceptive, equally confused." Unquote. The stinking hypocrisy of this. This chapter is full of sanctimonious insults lobbed at anthropologists for supposedly infantilizing indigenous cultures or our ancestors by doing things like using categories or comparing human hierarchies to animal hierarchies, or for the heinous crime of insisting that we might have egalitarian origins. Meanwhile, the authors portray indigenous people and our Paleolithic ancestors the way that cavemen or fictional indigenous people are portrayed in bad movies and TV shows. They do freaky-deaky things for no reason and with no context, because it just looks cool as a prop to tell your story and to sell more Pepsis. They choose hierarchy and male dominance and slavery for fun and grand seasonal theater. So mysterious, and they have superhuman powers of mystical wisdom. Unlike us, they can just magically morph their social structure to one form or another for some magical reasons that never get explained in this book. And the authors conclude, quote, "If there is a riddle here, it's this. Why, after millennia of constructing and disassembling forms of hierarchy, did Homo sapiens, supposedly the wisest of apes, allow permanent and intractable systems of inequality to take root? Was this really a consequence of adopting agriculture? Of settling down in permanent villages and later towns? Should we be looking for a moment in time like the one Rousseau envisaged, when somebody first enclosed a tract of land declaring, 'This is mine and always will be'? Or is that another fool's errand? These are the questions to which we now turn." Unquote. And those are the questions that I give them enormous props for asking, but which they have rendered themselves utterly incapable of answering because they insist on ignoring or insulting and slandering all of the scholarship that could actually explain those things. Next time, we'll see how the author's obnoxious attitudes and prejudices cause them to miss the answers to those questions, even when those answers are slapping them right in the face, as they finally investigate an actual egalitarian anarcho-communist society and decide to dismiss and insult them instead of actually learning anything from them. Okay, that one was a real doozy. If you want to know more about all the stuff I talked about today, a link to the bibliography for this episode should be up soon in the show notes and video notes. And you can also find a link to the written transcripts that you can share with people who are more into reading than watching my beautiful punim. Also, I've been doing a fun series of talks with Derek Varn. Hey Varn! About anthropology and politics. If you don't already know him, Varn is a walking encyclopedia of intellectual history, and in general he knows everything about everything and its grandmother when it comes to socialist intellectual history, so check out his Varn vlog to see us having some fun talks. Plus check out his other stuff. He's a regular on the This Is Revolution show, which is an excellent materialist podcast talk show. and he's doing Mortal Science with Esri from Swampside Chats, where they question and reevaluate the ins and outs of Marxism. So check him out, as Blesbeat says. And I finally did another interview with Arnold on the Fight Like an Animal show. The first interview we did, the audio was too messed up, so he never released it, but this one is a lot of fun. So check it out, and check out his show in general if you haven't already. It's maybe my number one favorite political podcast. I also have an art history correction to do, but I'll just do it next time because this episode is just so damn long and I'm very tired. And finally, speaking of being very tired, if you can, give me money. It takes me more than a month full-time to make these critique videos, and it blows a real hole in my already extremely modest income, and I've been doing this non-stop since August without much of a break so that I can finish this before people lose interest in this book. So if what I'm doing is valuable to you and you have some disposable income, please subscribe to my Patreon. I don't monetize my channel, even though I'm eligible for it, because I don't want to gunk up your life with more stupid advertisements than what you're already subjected to, and I don't do paywalled content because that defeats the whole purpose of doing a show geared at spreading knowledge and skills. So your subscriptions are not purchasing a commodity, they're solidarity payments, and you're making them because you're someone who can afford to do it and you want the show to keep going. And note that I charge per episode, not per month, because it takes so long to actually make one of these, and sometimes I need to take breaks and work on different projects, and I don't want to be stuck with cranking out stuff just for the sake of cranking out stuff. And please like and subscribe, and also review the show on iTunes or Apple Music. It's really important and helps the show pop up more readily on searches. And contact me with any corrections or suggestions or comments at worldwidescroats@gmail.com, or comment on the YouTubes. And until next time, see ya!